The United States is exerting its influence all over the world. Let me get this book out of the way. And, we've talked about how they've exerted their influence in the Pacific Ocean, right over here in all these islands. They are starting to make claims and exert power over the Caribbean. That's now called America's Big Lake because the United States is kind of patrolling around. Remember that cartoon of Roosevelt with his big stick, right? We're controlling a lot of the parts of the world that are around us and extended into the Pacific in an effort to expand our American empire. And the next region we're going to expand into and try to influence and exert power is East Asia, in especially Japan and China. So that's what we're going to look at in this video. So like I said, we're looking at this idea of American imperialism, and we talked about imperialism in the Pacific and in the Caribbean, and now let's look at imperialism in East Asia. And we're going to start with Japan. Uh, think about it this way. For really thousands of years, the Eastern world, Japan, China, India, Australia, all of those, that the Eastern Hemisphere really has a separate history from the rest of the world, from the Western world. Think Europe and North America and South America. So Japan and China have developed their own cultures. They've kind of developed their civilizations at a different pace. They look very different to the Western worlds until the 19th century. That's really where everything changes, right around this time of imperialism that we're talking about. So Japan had closed off to the rest of the world. They didn't want to be influenced by Western culture. They loved their culture and the way they did things. Think of the samurai and the shoguns and the kimonos. They had this whole culture that they loved and they wanted to preserve, and they didn't want it to be influenced by the Western world. So they've kind of been hiding on the other side of the world for centuries. Well, that all changes in 1853 when the American Commodore Matthew Perry, not the Matthew Perry from Friends, this is another guy, Commodore Matthew Perry opens Japan to the Western world. He basically shows up with an American Navy and says, "Hey, Japan, we would like to trade with you, please." And again, this is kind of us waving that big stick around. Here's our Navy. What are you going to do about it? And so Japan decides, you know what, let's not fight back. Let's let the Americans in. Let's let the European powers in, and let's start connecting with the rest of the world. And so immediately, this is actually good for Japan in a lot of ways because they begin to grow as an imperial power and to extend their power and influence all over the world. Now, as we know, they are not the only ones. So they are going to end up having to compete with other imperial powers of the time. And so one example of that is the Russo-Japanese War. This was a military conflict between Japan and Russia in which these two nations competed for imperialist control and expansion in East Asia. Russia is trying to expand its empire, and so is Japan, and they meet in an area called Manchuria, which is in northern China. They're both trying to take over this territory and extend their influence, and so they end up fighting this war. Now, to the great surprise of the whole world, Japan actually defeats Russia and forces Russia to abandon their expansion in the region. And so what does this have to do with the United States? Well, because we are trying to extend our power and influence all over the world, Theodore Roosevelt and the United States step in to negotiate a peace treaty with the Russians and the Japanese. This is a form of imperialism, right? It's not just that we're taking over countries, it's that we're also we're going to be the ones to go influence international politics. And so this moment is an example of that. President Roosevelt meets with the Japanese and Russian delegates to negotiate the Treaty of Portsmouth in 1905. This ends the Russian and Japanese war, and the United States begins to have more friendly relations with Japan. There had been some rising nativism in the United States and discrimination against Japanese immigrants, and so the United States and Japan works out this gentleman's agreement that the United States will stop discriminating against the Japanese, but the Japanese will also kind of start restricting how many Japanese immigrants are coming to the United States. And so this negotiation is a good example of imperialism. So one of the other things the United States does at the same time period to demonstrate U.S. naval power, to kind of flex our muscle, uh, to demonstrate it to Japan and other nations, President Roosevelt sends this huge fleet of battleships on an around the world cruise, basically to just cruise around and show the whole world, check out our ships, check out our military naval power, don't mess with us. This is just us flexing our imperialist muscle all over the world. And these great white ships made quite an impressive sight to Japan and other nations. It really showed, this great white fleet showed how powerful the United States was becoming. So let's turn our attention from Japan to China. Now, what's going on in China at this time is that European powers are trading with China. And they're trading so much with China that a lot of these European nations are really influencing Chinese policies and influencing the Chinese culture. And a lot of the Chinese don't like this. But if you see here on the map on the left, you see what are called these spheres of influence. That each of these European nations has kind of cut up China into little chunks that they have exclusive rights to trade and enter and influence. So you can see that in the cartoon on the right, that and this is obviously a racist cartoon, how it's portraying the Chinese, but you can see these European powers slicing up China for themselves, and China's sitting there like, what? This is our country, what are you doing? Now, this restricted the United States from really coming into China and exerting its influence and power, and that's something the United States wants to do. So, what the United States does is actually pretty ballsy, we might say. So the United States Secretary of State, John Hay, that's a name you need to remember, John Hay. He looks at China, he looks at those spheres of influence, and the United States is trying to get in, and he says, you know what, we're going to declare a new policy, and it's going to be called the open door policy, and we're going to put our foot down and say, European nations, you can't have exclusive rights to China. Everyone gets to have equal trading rights with China. So this cartoon kind of shows that, right? That the European countries are cutting up China into pieces, and the United States, Uncle Sam, is stepping in and saying, no, we're all going to share China. And, you know, deep down, though, you know, in our mind, we're trying to get our feet in to China. Here's another cartoon of Uncle Sam opening the door to China. It's this open door policy, letting everybody in and out to trade as they please. So if you want to be writing this down in your notes, this is a really important policy of imperialism, this open door policy. It gave equal trading rights to all foreign nations in China. And remember, this is the United States saying this. It's not China saying, yeah, you guys all come in. It's the United States. This is imperialism, right? This arrogant imperialism that we're saying, all right, everybody can go into China. It's us exerting our power in China. And John Hay sends notes to the other nations that says, hey, this is the policy now, and you got to follow it. And it's just a really interesting move by Mr. John Hay and President McKinley at the time in 1899. So that's the open door policy. Now, obviously, as we mentioned already, the Chinese, not everyone is happy with this. In China around this time, there's a lot of nationalism and xenophobia on the rise. Xenophobia is this hatred and fear of foreigners. You might recognize that. We still see some of that in the United States. But it's on the rise in China. China is looking at all these European powers in the United States and saying, look, this is our country. Y'all need to get out of here and stop influencing us. They're tired of Westerners coming into their country to take advantage of them. So some of the Chinese step up and start a rebellion. And that rebellion is called the Boxer Rebellion. The Chinese rebels opposed to Western influence start a rebellion. It's called the Boxer Rebellion because a lot of the rebels practiced a form of Chinese martial arts that the Westerners called Chinese boxing. And so the Boxers are the Chinese rebels. Now, this is threatening to the lives of a lot of the foreigners because they're really rebelling against foreign influence. So a lot of these European nations, the United States, are worried that this rebellion could end up ending the lives of a lot of Americans and other Europeans in China. And so the Europeans and the United States, they're going to join forces against the Boxer Rebellion. Let me just show you a couple pictures. This is where you can see on the map on the right where this rebellion is happening. These are some of those boxers, those martial artists on the left who are starting this rebellion. Now, unfortunately, they don't have the kind of weapon power that the Western world has. Here's some other cool pictures. Like I said, we're entering a time period where we can see uh, history happening in pictures and in video pretty soon, and some audio recordings. So these are real pictures from the Boxer Rebellion of the Chinese boxers fighting against foreign influence. And so the European powers and the United States all form an alliance called the Eight Nation Alliance. And because they're all joining up to crush this Boxer Rebellion, the rebellion doesn't stand much of a chance. And that's what ends up happening. The Eight Nation Alliance crushes the rebellion. The Boxer Rebellion is over. Um, and the United States makes sure, John Hay, the Secretary of State, makes sure to send more notes out to those European nations and say, look, just because we just crushed this rebellion doesn't mean that we're going to take over China. We're going to let them rule themselves. We want trade. We don't want anyone conquering China. And so that was the end of the Boxer Rebellion. Here are some of those boxers who've been rounded up to be executed. And this next picture might be a little bit upsetting to some, but this is a picture of the boxer rebels being executed. Now, all of these are examples of the United States exerting power and influence over the world. When we're stepping into Japan and saying, hey, you're going to trade with us, and then sending our ships around the world to flex our imperialist muscle, that's imperialism. When we're negotiating, uh, we're helping negotiate between Russia and Japan in their war that we had no part in, that's imperialism. We're exerting our power in those areas. And when we step into China and pass the open door policy and crush the Boxer Rebellion, these are all examples of American imperialism. Some of it positive because it helps our nation grow, but you can see that some of it is fairly negative. That there's some dark sides to imperialism.